You can measure a company by how it treats the people no one notices. The words echoed through Elijah Brooks' mind as he pushed a gray maintenance cart across the polished marble lobby before sunrise. The building stood silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whir of an industrial vacuum somewhere down the hall. Dressed in a faded Navy janitor's uniform with a simple plastic badge that read Elijah, he looked no different from the dozens of maintenance workers who entered through the service door every morning. That was exactly what he wanted. For the next 30 days, the founder and CEO of Brooks Dynamics would not sit in the executive suite overlooking the city skyline. He would not attend board meetings, approve million-dollar contracts, or travel in a chauffeured sedan. Instead, he would clean fingerprints from glass doors, empty trash bins, mop hallways, and quietly observe the company he had spent 20 years building from a single rented office into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in America. Only two people knew the truth. His longtime attorney had signed the confidential paperwork, and the chairman of the board believed Elijah was taking a month-long leadership retreat. Everyone else believed the CEO was away. As Elijah wheeled his cart toward the employee entrance, workers streamed past him without making eye contact. Some offered a polite nod. Others walked around him as though he were another piece of office furniture. He took mental notes, but never showed disappointment. Invisible people often witnessed what powerful people never could. The first floor smelled of fresh coffee and floor polish. Morning sunlight filtered through towering windows, casting long golden reflections across the marble tiles he had polished only an hour earlier. A young receptionist smiled warmly and thanked him for holding the elevator. A security guard greeted him by name after reading his badge. Small acts of respect stood out because they required nothing in return. Upstairs, however, the atmosphere shifted. Managers hurried through the corridors speaking about deadlines, quarterly numbers, and client presentations. A supervisor frowned at a maintenance worker whose supply cart briefly blocked a hallway, muttering that cleaners always seemed to appear at the wrong time. Elijah quietly moved the cart aside and offered a calm apology, even though the hallway had been nearly empty. No one recognized the calm confidence behind his steady eyes. Before beginning this experiment, Elijah had promised himself one rule above all others. He would not interfere. He would not reveal who he was. He would simply watch, listen, and learn. Somewhere inside these walls, hidden beneath polished conference tables and carefully rehearsed mission statements, was the real culture of Brooks Dynamics. If the company truly reflected the values he believed it stood for, he would return his office with peace of mind. But if it did not, the next 30 days would change far more than his own understanding. They would determine the future of every person who worked beneath this roof. By the third morning, Elijah no longer felt like a visitor wearing someone else's uniform. The stiff fabric had begun to soften around the sleeves, and the familiar weight of the maintenance cart rolled almost effortlessly beneath his hands. He arrived before 5:30 every morning, long before the first executives crossed the lobby with steaming coffee cups and leather briefcases. Those quiet hours belonged to people whose names rarely appeared in company newsletters. Rosa from housekeeping hummed old gospel songs while wiping conference tables until they reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Daniel from security always carried an extra thermos because he believed nobody should begin a 12-hour shift without hot coffee. Luis from facilities repaired broken chairs instead of replacing them because he hated wasting company money. None of them spoke about stock prices or quarterly earnings. They spoke about aging parents, children's report cards, rising grocery bills, and helping one another survive another week. Elijah listened more than he talked. Every conversation quietly revealed a company hidden beneath the polished presentations delivered upstairs. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the atmosphere changed. Elevators filled with pressed suits and hurried footsteps. Voices became sharper. Smiles became shorter. A regional operations director named Richard Collins walked across the lobby without looking away from his phone. Employees instinctively stepped aside before he even reached them. His reputation seemed to arrive several feet ahead of him. Elijah noticed something else. Richard greeted senior managers by their first names, complimented visiting clients with effortless charm, yet passed maintenance staff as though they were invisible. It was not open hostility. It was something colder. Indifference. The kind that slowly convinced people they did not matter. Near lunchtime, Elijah found a handwritten maintenance request taped beneath a reception desk. Someone had reported a leaking pipe 2 weeks earlier. The request had never been processed. Water continued dripping into a small bucket hidden behind decorative plants where customers could not see it. The receptionist sighed quietly when Elijah discovered it. She admitted she had submitted the same request 3 different times, but every budget approval had been delayed because executive offices were being renovated first. Elijah crouched beside the cabinet, tightened the loose fitting, and stopped the leak within minutes using inexpensive parts from his cart. The receptionist smiled with genuine relief. She thanked him as though he had solved an impossible problem. Elijah simply nodded and wrote another note inside the small black notebook resting in his pocket. Not about the pipe, about priorities. Later that afternoon, he entered the employee cafeteria carrying a tray with soup, crackers, and iced tea. Plenty of empty seats surrounded the maintenance crew, yet several office employees chose to stand while scrolling through their phones instead of sharing a table with them. Across the room, Rosa quietly invited a nervous new intern to sit beside the housekeeping team after noticing he was eating alone. Within moments, they were laughing together about his first week on the job. Elijah watched the scene unfold beneath the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall windows. Leadership seminars often describe culture with impressive words projected onto giant screens. Yet here, between a bowl of soup and a simple invitation, he witnessed something far more honest. The people carrying the smallest titles were quietly protecting the humanity of the entire company, while many of those carrying the greatest authority seemed too busy to notice. The first week ended with a pattern that was becoming impossible for Elijah to ignore. Every polished executive presentation spoke about respect, teamwork, and opportunity, yet the rhythm of the building told a different story once the conference room doors closed. Early Friday morning, a heavy rain covered the city, turning the glass walls into shimmering sheets of silver. Employees hurried inside, carrying umbrellas and paper cups of coffee, while maintenance workers quietly placed yellow caution signs near the entrance to keep everyone safe. Elijah pushed a floor dryer across the wet marble, carefully removing every footprint before another stream of people entered. A young accountant smiled and thanked him for preventing someone from slipping. Moments later, another employee crossed directly over the freshly cleaned floor without a glance, leaving muddy tracks stretching nearly 20 feet across the lobby. Elijah simply returned to work. He did not sigh. He did not complain. He only observed. Just after 9 o'clock, Richard Collins gathered department managers outside the executive conference room. His tailored charcoal suit looked flawless beneath the bright ceiling lights, and his confident voice echoed through the corridor with practiced authority. He congratulated several division leaders for exceeding financial targets before reminding everyone that operating expenses needed to be reduced before the next quarterly report. As the meeting ended, one manager quietly mentioned that the facilities department had requested replacement equipment because several cleaning machines were more than 12 years old and frequently broke down. Richard barely paused. He replied that maintenance costs could wait another quarter because customers never noticed the equipment anyway. The managers nodded and dispersed without another question. Elijah lowered his eyes and slowly wrote another sentence inside the small black notebook resting in his pocket. Budget decisions reveal values more honestly than speeches ever can. Later that afternoon, he entered the basement supply room searching for fresh mop heads. The room was cramped, dimly lit, and lined with aging shelves that carried labels faded from years of use. Rosa was carefully repairing a vacuum cleaner using spare parts she had collected over several months. Daniel tightened the loose wheel on an old utility cart instead of requesting a replacement because he knew the request would likely remain unanswered. They laughed together while solving problems with creativity rather than money, never realizing the man listening quietly beside them, possessed the authority to approve every purchase in the building with a single signature. Their pride came not from the tools they had, but from the care they invested in every task. As evening approached, Elijah carried several bags of recycling toward the loading dock. Passing a hallway outside the finance offices, he noticed a young intern standing alone beside a copier, shoulders tense, staring at a stack of reports that had accidentally spilled across the floor. Before Elijah could offer assistance, Rosa appeared without hesitation. She knelt beside the intern, helped organize every page, and smiled as though losing a few extra minutes at the end of her shift did not matter. The intern thanked her repeatedly, visibly relieved. From the opposite end of the hallway, Richard witnessed the interaction for only a moment before continuing toward the elevators without slowing his pace. Elijah watched the closing elevator doors reflect the warm hallway lights like polished mirrors. In that brief silence, he realized the greatest divide inside Brooks Dynamics was not between executives and hourly employees. It was between those who believed every person carried equal dignity and those who believed a person's value rose and fell with the title printed beneath a name. The second week began with an unusual stillness that settled over Brooks Dynamics like a morning fog. Outside, a cool breeze swept across the parking lot, carrying the scent of fresh rain through the loading dock as employees hurried inside with their laptops tucked beneath their arms. Elijah arrived before dawn as always, unlocking the maintenance closet and checking the day's work orders pinned neatly to a corkboard. Most requests involved routine cleaning, burned-out light fixtures, and overflowing recycling bins, but one handwritten note immediately caught his attention. The break room on the 6th floor had been reported for a malfunctioning refrigerator nearly 3 weeks earlier. Several employees had submitted requests, yet every ticket had been marked as pending. Elijah quietly gathered his tools and made his way upstairs. Inside the break room, cartons of milk had spoiled, lunches had been discarded, and a faint, unpleasant odor lingered in the air despite someone's effort to hide it with air freshener. 2 customer service representatives joked that replacing the refrigerator probably cost less than one executive dinner downtown. Their laughter faded quickly as they returned to answering client calls. Elijah examined the appliance and discovered the problem was nothing more than a worn electrical relay worth less than $20. Within 15 minutes, the refrigerator hummed back to life. A small crowd applauded softly, grateful that someone had finally cared enough to solve a problem everyone else had ignored. Elijah smiled politely, accepted their thanks, and wrote another observation into his notebook. Simple problems become expensive when nobody feels responsible. Later that morning, he pushed his maintenance cart past the executive conference center where Richard Collins was leading another strategy meeting. Through the partially open doors, Elijah heard confident promises about improving employee satisfaction and strengthening company culture before the annual shareholder presentation. Elegant charts glowed across a massive screen, while polished voices discussed percentages, efficiency, and public image. The contrast lingered in Elijah's mind as he continued down the hallway toward a storage room, where Rosa was carefully folding clean microfiber cloths that had already been patched several times. She laughed softly and explained that the department had learned to repair almost everything because replacement requests rarely reached approval. Daniel soon joined them, carrying a loose wheel from another aging supply cart. Instead of complaining, the 3 of them worked together, sharing tools, ideas, and quiet encouragement. Their resourcefulness reminded Elijah why the company had once earned its reputation for resilience. It had never been built solely by visionary executives or celebrated investors. It had been sustained every single day by ordinary people who refused to let standards fall, even when resources did. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting long golden reflections across the polished corridor, Elijah paused beside the lobby and watched employees pass in both directions. Some offered warm greetings to the maintenance staff. Others never lifted their eyes from their phones. Every encounter added another piece to the picture forming inside his mind. He had entered this experiment expecting to uncover isolated problems. Instead, he was beginning to see two entirely different companies living beneath the same roof. One was defined by titles, appearances, and authority. The other was quietly held together by humility, kindness, and people who believed every task deserved the same care, whether anyone noticed or not. Elijah closed his notebook slowly, knowing the most difficult discoveries were still waiting to reveal themselves. The middle of the third week arrived with a quiet tension that even the morning sunlight could not soften. The lobby sparkled beneath freshly polished glass. Fresh flowers decorated the reception desk, and banners announcing the upcoming annual leadership meeting had appeared throughout the building. Executives walked with renewed confidence, knowing investors would soon visit headquarters. Yet beneath the polished surface, Elijah sensed an uneasiness growing stronger each day. The people who worked closest to the foundation of the company carried that feeling without speaking it aloud. Shortly before lunch, he entered the records department to replace several burned-out ceiling lights. Boxes of archived documents lined the walls, and the steady hum of printers filled the room. That was where he noticed Denise Carter, a veteran administrative specialist who had worked at Brooks Dynamics for nearly 18 years. She carefully reviewed contract files with remarkable precision, double-checking every page before placing it into secure storage. Rosa quietly whispered that Denise was one of the most dependable employees in the entire company. Yet she had been overlooked for promotion several times because she preferred doing the work correctly instead of drawing attention to herself. Elijah admired the calm professionalism in her movements. Nothing about her suggested someone looking for recognition. She simply believed the job deserved her best effort. Minutes later, hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Richard Collins entered with two department managers following closely behind him. His expression remained composed, but the atmosphere changed immediately. One confidential proposal prepared for an important client could not be located, and every minute increased the pressure. Richard asked several sharp questions before his eyes settled on Denise's desk. She explained that she had completed her assignment exactly according to company procedure and had logged every document into the tracking system before leaving the previous evening. Her voice remained respectful, steady, and confident. Richard listened without interrupting, then instructed the managers to search the department once again. Employees quietly opened filing cabinets, examined storage shelves, and reviewed electronic records. Elijah continued replacing the light fixture overhead while observing every detail without attracting attention. He noticed one overlooked cart parked near the conference hallway where outgoing presentation materials had been stacked earlier that morning. A thin blue folder rested beneath several marketing binders, almost completely hidden from view. Elijah immediately recognized the client identification label. For a brief moment, he considered walking over and pointing to it. Instead, he remained exactly where he was. His promise to observe before acting still guided every decision. Within minutes, a young finance intern named Ethan Reed entered the hallway, carrying additional presentation materials. As he organized the stack, he discovered the misplaced folder and quickly realized what had happened. He looked toward Denise, then toward Richard. The entire hallway fell unusually quiet. Ethan could have placed the folder back without saying a word and avoided becoming involved. Instead, he stepped forward calmly and explained that the document had been accidentally mixed with presentation materials during the previous evening's preparation. Denise had done nothing wrong. Relief spread across several faces, but what caught Elijah's attention was not the recovered file. It was the silence that followed. No one had intentionally accused Denise, yet almost everyone had been willing to assume the mistake belonged to the quiet employee who rarely defended herself. Richard accepted the explanation with a brief nod before turning his attention to the next meeting, never pausing to acknowledge Denise's professionalism or Ethan's honesty. As the hallway slowly emptied, Denise thanked the young intern with a warm smile that carried more grace than resentment. Elijah wrote another sentence inside his black notebook before gently closing its cover. Character was never revealed when everything went according to plan. It revealed itself in the few quiet moments when someone chose fairness over convenience, even when nobody important seemed to be watching. The fourth week arrived wrapped in an unusual calm, the kind of silence that often settled over the building just before something important changed. Outside, pale morning light stretched across the parking lot, reflecting softly from rows of rain-soaked cars. Inside, the familiar scent of fresh coffee mixed with floor polish drifted through the lobby as Elijah guided his maintenance cart toward the upper floors. Every hallway now felt different to him. He no longer saw departments or job titles. He saw people carrying invisible burdens. Rosa quietly checked on a co-worker whose husband had recently undergone surgery. Daniel stayed an extra hour helping. A new security officer learned the evening routine without asking for overtime. Ethan continued arriving early, determined to earn trust rather than recognition. They carried themselves with a quiet dignity that never appeared in performance reports. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Elijah received a work order requesting immediate cleanup in one of the executive conference rooms after a strategy session. As he entered, polished leather chairs surrounded a long walnut table scattered with empty coffee cups, printed financial forecasts, and half-finished presentation notes. The executives had already left for another meeting, but fragments of their conversation still lingered in the room. A page left carelessly on the table listed another round of proposed budget reductions. Once again, the largest cuts targeted facilities, maintenance, and employee support services. Elijah folded the paper neatly and placed it exactly where he had found it before quietly continuing his work. He did not need confidential documents to understand the direction the company was taking. He had already witnessed the consequences every day. That afternoon, while replacing air filters near the employee lounge, he overheard a conversation between Denise and Ethan. Denise thanked the young intern once again for speaking honestly during the missing file incident. Ethan smiled modestly and admitted he had nearly stayed silent because he feared embarrassing senior leadership. He paused before adding something Elijah would remember long after the experiment ended. He said that if people became afraid of telling the truth inside a company, then every report, every meeting, and every success would eventually become meaningless. Denise looked at him with quiet pride and replied that courage often sounded very ordinary when spoken by decent people. Elijah remained hidden behind the open maintenance panel, listening without interrupting. Those simple words settled heavily in his heart. As evening approached, the building slowly emptied. Golden sunlight poured through the western windows, casting long reflections across the freshly polished floors until the corridors glowed with a warm amber light. Elijah finished collecting the last recycling bin before walking alone to the rooftop maintenance access overlooking the city skyline. A gentle breeze carried distant traffic sounds while office lights gradually illuminated one building after another across the horizon. He removed the small black notebook from his pocket and slowly turned through its pages. Every observation painted the same picture. The greatest strength inside Brooks Dynamics did not come from impressive quarterly numbers or expensive executive offices. It came from ordinary employees who chose integrity even when nobody rewarded it. Yet the culture surrounding them was slowly teaching the opposite lesson. Elijah closed the notebook and rested both hands against the cool metal railing. His 30-day experiment was nearly over. He had entered hoping to confirm the values upon which he had built the company. Instead, he had uncovered something far more important. The business itself remained strong, but its soul was quietly drifting away. And when the final day arrived, everyone inside the building would finally learn what the silent janitor had been seeing all along. Monday arrived with crisp autumn air and an unusual sense of anticipation flowing through Brooks Dynamics. Every digital display in the lobby welcomed employees to the annual leadership assembly scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. Staff members straightened their jackets, adjusted presentation folders, and exchanged quiet conversations as they gathered near the elevators. Elijah moved through the familiar corridors one final time, wearing the same Navy maintenance uniform that had become almost second nature during the past 4 weeks. His cart rolled softly across the polished floor, and several employees greeted him with genuine smiles. Rosa thanked him for always lending a hand without being asked. Daniel offered him the last cup of fresh coffee from the security office. Ethan paused before entering the auditorium and wished him a good morning with the same quiet respect he showed every employee regardless of title. Elijah returned each greeting with a warm smile, knowing those simple moments mattered more than any executive ceremony. Waiting upstairs, as the building gradually emptied into the auditorium, silence settled over the hallways. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting bright reflections across the marble floor that Elijah himself had polished before dawn. He walked slowly through the executive corridor, carefully looking at every office door, every conference room, every framed photograph celebrating the company's success. 20 years of sacrifice had built these walls, but the greatest lessons of the past 30 days had come from people whose pictures never appeared in those frames. Reaching the maintenance locker room, Elijah placed the worn cleaning gloves neatly inside his cart and rested his hand on the small black notebook that had remained in his pocket since the first day of the experiment. Page after page contained observations, names, dates, and quiet acts of integrity that no quarterly report had ever measured. He did not feel anger as he turned the final page. He felt clarity. The purpose of the experiment had never been to embarrass anyone. It had been to discover whether the culture inside the company still reflected the principles upon which it had been founded. Outside the locker room, footsteps echoed through the empty service hallway. The chairman of the board quietly approached, carrying a dark garment bag and a familiar leather portfolio. Without speaking, he handed both to Elijah. For several moments, neither man said anything. The quiet carried more meaning than words could have expressed. Elijah unzipped the garment bag and removed the charcoal suit he had not worn in nearly a month. The fabric felt strangely unfamiliar after weeks spent in work boots and maintenance gloves. He folded the janitor's uniform with deliberate care, placing it inside the locker rather than leaving it behind carelessly. It had reminded him every single day that dignity was never stitched into expensive clothing. It lived inside character. A few minutes later, the auditorium lights dimmed as hundreds of employees settled into their seats. Richard Collins stood near the stage reviewing his opening remarks with calm confidence, believing the morning would proceed exactly as planned. Conversations faded into silence. A large screen illuminated behind the podium, displaying only the company logo against a dark background. Then, just as the master of ceremonies prepared to introduce the returning chief executive, the side doors at the rear of the auditorium opened quietly. Every head slowly turned toward the entrance as a familiar figure stepped inside, no longer wearing a maintenance badge, but carrying the same small black notebook that had witnessed everything. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The familiar face they had passed in the hallways every morning stood beneath the bright stage lights, wearing the charcoal suit that had once appeared only in annual reports and framed magazine covers. Elijah Brooks walked toward the podium with the same calm expression he had carried while pushing a maintenance cart through the building before sunrise. The only difference was that every person in the auditorium finally understood who had been quietly observing them for the past 30 days. Richard Collins remained frozen near the front row, his prepared remarks still resting inside a leather folder that suddenly seemed meaningless. Around him, department heads exchanged bewildered glances while whispers spread across the auditorium like a gentle wind moving through autumn leaves. Elijah reached the podium but did not begin speaking immediately. Instead, he placed the small black notebook on the polished wood surface and slowly looked across the audience. His eyes stopped for a brief moment on Rosa, Daniel, Denise, and Ethan before sweeping across every department represented in the room. The silence felt heavy, not with fear, but with expectation. Then the large screen behind him illuminated. It did not display financial charts or market forecasts. It showed ordinary moments captured by internal security cameras during the past month. Rosa helping the nervous intern organize scattered documents after everyone else had walked away. Daniel carrying extra coffee for an exhausted overnight employee without expecting recognition. Ethan stepping forward to tell the truth when remaining silent would have been easier. Denise, patiently assisting co-workers who had interrupted her own work because they needed guidance. One quiet scene followed another. There were no dramatic confrontations. No embarrassing accusations. Only simple acts of honesty, compassion, and professionalism performed by people whose names rarely appeared in executive meetings. The room remained completely silent. Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady and warm. He said that during the past month he had expected to discover weaknesses in procedures, budgets, and operations. Instead, he had discovered something far more valuable. He had found the true heart of Brooks Dynamics working long before sunrise and staying late after sunset, carried by employees who believed every person deserved dignity regardless of title. Another image appeared on the screen. It showed aging maintenance equipment held together through careful repairs instead of proper replacement. Then another displayed unresolved facility requests waiting weeks for inexpensive solutions. Another revealed employees quietly purchasing office supplies with their own money because approved budgets had never arrived. Elijah never raised his voice. He simply allowed each image to remain visible long enough for the audience to understand what it represented. Richard lowered his eyes as the pattern became impossible to ignore. The issue had never been isolated mistakes. It had been a culture that celebrated impressive presentations while overlooking everyday responsibility. Elijah closed a notebook gently before continuing. He explained that leadership was not measured by the size of an office, the title on a business card, or the authority to approve budgets. Leadership revealed itself in the ordinary choices people made when they believed nobody important was watching. He smiled softly toward Rosa and the maintenance team seated near the back of the auditorium. Then he announced the first decision of the morning. Before discussing profits, expansions, or shareholder expectations, the company would begin by honoring the employees whose integrity had quietly protected its values every single day. For the first time in many years, the loudest applause inside. Brooks Dynamics did not come for an executive. It rose for the people who had spent their careers working almost entirely unnoticed. The applause faded slowly, but the feeling inside the auditorium remained. It was not excitement. It was reflection. Elijah Brooks stepped away from the podium and walked down the center aisle instead of returning backstage. The polished floor reflected the warm afternoon light pouring through the high windows, and every step echoed gently through the quiet room. He stopped beside Rosa first. With a grateful smile, he thanked her for reminding him that service was never measured by a paycheck. He shook Daniel's hand and told him that protecting people always mattered more than protecting appearances. He thanked Denise for proving that integrity did not need an audience to remain unwavering. Finally, he turned toward Ethan. The young intern looked almost uncomfortable standing beneath the attention of hundreds of coworkers. Elijah smiled and said that companies did not build their future by hiring perfect people. They built it by encouraging honest ones. A quiet warmth spread across the audience. No speeches of apology were requested. No public embarrassment followed. Elijah believed lasting change could not grow from humiliation. It had to begin with responsibility. During the weeks that followed, Brooks Dynamics changed in ways no annual report could fully capture. The oldest maintenance equipment was replaced. Long-delayed repair requests were completed. Every department, from executive floor to the loading dock, shared the same employee dining space several days each month. Senior leaders were expected to spend time working alongside frontline teams, not as a publicity event, but as part of understanding the people whose work supported the company every day. Employee recognition no longer focused only on sales records or financial milestones. Acts of honesty, teamwork, kindness, and service became equally worthy of celebration. Richard Collins requested a private meeting with Elijah several days after the assembly. He admitted that somewhere along the way he had begun managing numbers instead of people. Elijah listened, without interruption. When Richard finished, Elijah simply replied that leadership was learned every day, and every day offered another opportunity to choose differently. There was no anger between them, only an honest conversation that should have happened long before. Months later, visitors entering Brooks Dynamics often noticed something unusual. Executives held doors open for maintenance workers. New employees learned every department before receiving permanent assignments. Receptionists, engineers, custodians, analysts, and managers greeted one another by name. The atmosphere felt lighter because respect no longer depended on position. Early one autumn morning, long after the headlines about Elijah's unusual experiment had disappeared, he arrived before sunrise wearing a tailored suit once again. The lobby stood quiet beneath soft golden light filtering through the eastern windows. As he crossed the marble floor, he noticed a small paper cup lying near the entrance. No one else was around. He bent down, picked it up, and carried it to the recycling bin before continuing toward the elevators. A new janitor, only a few weeks into the job, hurried over looking embarrassed that he had not reached it first. Elijah smiled warmly and gently shook his head. He said that every building stayed clean because someone cared enough to notice the little things. The young man smiled back, and together they walked through the lobby as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the glass walls. Outside, the city slowly awakened. Inside, Brooks Dynamics had rediscovered something even more valuable than success. It had remembered that the true measure of leadership was never found in the office at the top of the building. It was revealed in the quiet choices made when no one believed they were being seen.